And it's especially nice for the first talk of Hilary term to welcome back an alumna, Lucy Cragg. And Lucy, I was thinking this morning and calculating the dates, and I realised it is a special year for you because it's 20 years.
It makes me feel so old. Thanks, Kate.
Years since you matriculated. It makes you feel old. As me, as your former undergraduate tutor, I feel positively ancient. Anyway, and enough of my musing. Very nice to welcome you back. And I'd like to begin formal proceedings by introducing Dr. Carla Holmboe, who's a MRC Career Development Fellow in the department. Carla's own work is on the development of attention and executive control in infancy and early childhood, and so seemed the absolute right person to introduce our speaker today. So I'm going to turn off my screen. If I could just remind everybody to keep themselves on mute. We're obviously hoping to have questions at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, if you use the raise your hand function, we can then unmute you, or you can unmute yourselves and ask the question, hopefully in the normal way and in a way that's as interactive as possible, given that we're all separated in space. So Carla, if I can go to you, and enjoy the talk, everybody.
Hey, yeah, so well, it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lucy Cragg. Lucy did her PhD here at the Department of Experimental Psychology at Oxford. She then moved to the School of Psychology at the University of Nottingham, first as an ESRC postdoctoral fellow and then as an RC UK academic fellow. And she's now an associate professor in the school. And in 2017, Lucy received the Margaret Donaldson Prize for outstanding early career contributions to developmental psychology. And in her research, Lucy has investigated the development of inhibitory control in school-age children, executive functions and math skills in children born preterm, as well as mechanisms underlying distractibility in children. And today she's going to tell us about her work on the role of executive functions in multiple components of math proficiency. So over to you, Lucy.
Lovely, thanks, Carla. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see that okay? Fantastic. All right. So thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Carla. I'm really sad that I don't get to visit and see you all in person, but it's still nice to be able to share some of what I've been up to over the past few years. So today I'm going to talk about two projects that I've been involved in, looking at maths and executive functions, the SUM and the PRISM projects. And so to give you a bit of context for these, so the seeds of the idea for the skills underlying maths project actually came about when I was still at Oxford and I was doing my PhD on executive function development, and Kate Nasher was my supervisor. And at the time I shared an office with Camilla Gilmore, who was doing her PhD on the development of maths cognition. And at the time there was a bit of research on the relationship between executive function and maths, but it was either done by maths researchers who had wonderful maths tasks and then threw in a digit span task, a quick working memory task, or it was done by executive function researchers who had, very comprehensive battery of executive function tasks, and then a simple standardized maths test. And so we thought it would be a good idea to combine our expertise and kind of hopefully do a project that would do justice to both sides. And the SUM project started 10 years ago. So in that time, I've had all three of my children. Camilla's had her third child, and we both work part-time. So there's been a lot going on alongside this, but both of these projects actually are really collaborative projects. And so by working together and helping each other out over all those periods that we've been off work on maternity leave, hopefully we've still been able to do some good science and have some papers to show for it, which I'm going to talk to you about today. Okay, so maths is crucial for success in Western societies. Individuals who do well in maths at school have been found to have better job prospects when they're older, as well as to have a better quality of life. And at the other end of the spectrum, around a fifth of children leave primary school without reaching the maths level that's expected of them, and a similar number of adults have math skills which are below the basic level that are needed in everyday life. So for things like shopping, paying for bills at restaurants, those kind of things. And obviously a lot of time and effort goes into developing educational strategies to improve maths achievement. And And one way to really maximise this and achieve the best possible outcome for all children is to try and get a better understanding of the cognitive processes that underlie maths performance. And then this can provide a good evidence base and a starting point from which to develop the pedagogy to support maths in the classroom. So there's a whole range of different skills that underlie maths performance. So you've got domain specific skills, so things like being able to count, know all your number symbols, have good internal representations of those numbers and how they relate to each other. But then you've also got a whole range of domain general skills. So things like IQ, language ability, visuospatial skills, and what I'm going to focus on today, which are executive function skills. And executive functions are the set of skills that allow us to control and guide our attention, thoughts, and actions. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And so, as I said, there's been quite a lot of research. When we started this project, there was a lot of research that was showing kind of correlations between your performance on an executive function task, particularly working memory tasks. I'll go on explain a bit about what they are in a minute. So if you're good at an executive function task, then you tend to do well on a maths test. So there are lots of standardized tests to kind of see how good you are at maths, which are similar to maths tests that you use in the classroom. And we wanted to try and go a bit further and unpick this, this relationship in a bit more detail. So both maths skills and executive function skills involve a range of different processes. And when researchers talk about maths, what they often mean is arithmetic. So that's the example that I'm going to focus on to start with. And so when we think about arithmetic, we can break it down into factual knowledge, so knowing number facts, so like your number 1 to 10 or your times tables and being able to quickly retrieve these from memory. I talk about procedural skill, so knowing the steps that you need to take when you're given a sum to solve that problem, so counting, decomposing a sum, procedures like that. And it also relies on conceptual understanding. So understanding the concepts that underpin maths. So things like addition being the opposite of subtraction. So these underpin maths, and then executive functions are also often conceptualized as involving a range of processes. So working memory relates to being able to hold your goal or some information in mind. So an example in maths would be holding an interim solution in mind while you're completing a multi-part sum. Being able to ignore distractions or to suppress irrelevant responses, so inhibition, and often flexible thinking, so being able to switch between different tasks or being able to look at the same thing in slightly different ways. And it's been proposed by researchers such as David Geary that the relationship between domain general skills, so particularly executive functions, and maths, it's a hierarchical relationship. So executive functions support these component skills of maths, the factual, procedural, and conceptual knowledge, and then in turn, these support overall maths achievements. And we were interested in testing a model like this and also exploring how these different relationships between different executive function skills and different components of maths might change with age. So I'm going to talk to you today about the role of executive functions in 3 different areas, so 3 different studies. So I'm going to start off talking about maths achievement and arithmetic. So this is the largest study, will probably take up most of the talk. Then I'm going to talk about a replication and an extension that we've just recently done looking at algebra and geometry skills as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about advanced mathematics in undergraduate students. Okay, so the first of these was the main project in our SUM project, Skills Underlying Maths. And the main research questions for this project that we were interested in are which executive functions are related to those 3 components of maths that I mentioned, factual, procedural, and conceptual components, how these relationships change with age, and also to test that hierarchical model, do executive functions relate to maths achievement over and above the relationship with these components of arithmetic, or are they fully mediated by those components? So to take you through a bit of the background here and how executive functions might differentially relate to these different components of maths. So in terms of executive functions and factual knowledge, there are two schools of thought on this really. So the first is that domain general skills, executive function skills aren't really involved in fact retrieval, and that's because it's thought to be an automatic process. So it doesn't involve much kind of complex thinking. You see a sum, you automatically retrieve that fact from memory. So it's it's not relying on these more complex skills. But then the other side of the argument is that executive functions do in fact play a role in fact retrieval. And so it's been argued that numerical facts are stored in a verbal code in long-term memory, and that working memory, so particularly if you're talking about a Baddeley and Hitch style model, the central executive or the phonological loop might be needed to retrieve them from long-term memory, so suggesting a role from working memory in fact retrieval. And it's also been suggested that number facts are stored in an associative network, so a bit like the kind of lexicon. There's links and relationships between different facts. So, for example, times tables. When you're presented with a sum like 4 times 4, it might also partially activate 4 times 5, 4 plus 4, 3 times 4, kind of associated sums. And it's been argued that interference occurs between these different possible answers, and therefore some form of inhibitory control is required in order to suppress that interference. So there's some evidence out there for that side of the argument as well, that executive functions do play a role even in fact retrieval. Moving on to procedural skill, the kind of theoretical argument for this is that, so procedural skill is where you're kind of solving a more complex problem and knowing the steps that you need to take. So it's been argued that working memory is involved in order to represent the question in the first place, so particularly if you're doing mental maths, to be able to store the interim solutions as you work through different parts. Inhibition has been argued to be involved in order to select the appropriate strategy and to stop you inhibiting others. So, stop you from counting on your fingers to be able to use a more sophisticated strategy. And also that flexible thinking might be involved to enable you to shift between different operations and strategies as you're working through a problem or as you're doing sequential problems. And there's some empirical evidence as well for the relationship between executive functions and procedural skills. So a range of studies have shown that good working memory is linked to better procedural skills. So procedural tests are often measured just by giving people numerical kind of sums that are in numerical format and asking them to solve them. But the findings for inhibition and shifting are much more mixed. Some studies have shown a significant relationship and others haven't. And these mixed findings might in part be due to age differences between the sample. So it might be that in younger children, procedural skills rely heavily on executive functions, but that as children become older, the procedures become more automatic and they might rely more on fact retrieval as opposed to counting or decomposition. And so they become less reliant on executive function as they get older. In terms of executive functions and conceptual understanding, again, there's a theoretical argument here that executive functions play a role. So similar to factual knowledge, it's been suggested that working memory may be involved in retrieving concepts from long-term memory. So, you need to be able to retrieve that, that addition and subtraction are inverse of each other. Again, inhibition is thought to be involved to suppress procedural strategies. So just, when you see a sum, you just launch in straight away and take a step back and look at it and see if there are easier ways to solve it that you can do using your conceptual knowledge. And it's also been suggested that shifting or flexible thinking is important so that you can manipulate the form in which a problem is represented to be able to identify relationships and see the same problem in more than one way. In terms of empirical evidence, there's actually very little empirical work, certainly at the time that we did the grant, that had been done on conceptual understanding. There's a little bit of work on fractions concepts, but this seems to be very different in nature to the arithmetic work that we were looking at. there is a little bit of evidence that 7 to 10-year-olds who have poor inhibition skills may be more likely to use procedural than conceptual strategies, suggesting that they find that more difficult. But that's about it, really. And so in terms of our predictions, we expected that all of the components of executive function that we looked at, so I split working memory into verbal working memory and visuospatial working memory, we expected that all of these components of executive function would be correlated with maths achievement, such that if you have better executive function skills, then you're going to do better on a maths achievement test. For factual knowledge, we predicted that good verbal working memory and good inhibition skills would be related to good factual knowledge. For procedural skills, we predicted that, again, all aspects of executive function would be related to good procedural skills, but based on that suggestion that younger children may rely more on executive functions to carry out when they're carrying out procedures compared to adults who might use more automatic skills, we thought that this relationship, the relationships with inhibition and shifting, would be moderated by age. And then for conceptual understanding, the predictions here were based on those theoretical relationships that verbal working memory, inhibition, and shifting would be linked to good conceptual understanding. We also predicted that executive functions would explain more variance in maths achievement and procedural skills than they would in factual and conceptual understanding. Okay, so on to our method. So as I said, we were interested in seeing how these relationships change with age. So we tested 4 groups of participants. We had around 70 participants in each group. So we had a group in year 4, which are around 9 years of age, a group in year 7, so that's the first year of secondary school. So these were around 12 years, a group of year 9, so 14-year-olds, and then a group of undergraduate students, so average age of 21. And we saw each participant for approximately 2-hour testing session where we gave them a nice battery of maths and executive function tasks. So first of all, our maths tasks. So our measure of maths achievement was the maths reasoning subtest from the Wyatt. So this is kind of word problem based answers. Again, it's not limited to arithmetic, so it's all forms of different kinds of maths problems. So things like this one here, so which number goes in the empty circle? Obviously this is one aimed at younger age groups. I should also say we did test year 1 as part of the project, but I'm not going to talk about that today. That was work that we wrote up separately. Our measure of factual knowledge was a computerized task where we showed participants simple sums and asked them to provide an answer as quickly as they could. And we measured correct responses that were given under 3 seconds. We took that had kind of been automatically retrieved, was a known fact. For procedural knowledge, we asked participants to do slightly more complicated sums, and we also asked them how they gave the answer to the experimenter, and we then asked them how they completed that sum. So did the answer pop into their head? Did they count? Did they work it out in their head, or did they use their fingers? And for our measure of conceptual knowledge, we did it. It was a similar concept, but slightly different in the younger children compared to the older children and adults. The older children and adults was computerized. The younger children, we showed them a puppet and we showed them a sum, and then they had an example sum and we showed them another sum, and we had Rollo the rabbit, and we asked them, could Rollo use the first sum to help them answer the second sum, or did they have to work it out themselves? And again, for the older children and adults, they were shown 2 sums and asked if they could work out the second one based on the first one. And they were either linked or not based on various different conceptual relationships. So for our executive function tasks, we had our working memory tasks were based on a kind of Baddeley and Hitch complex span type task. So we used both verbal and visuospatial tasks. So we used storage, processing, and then combined storage and processing tasks that we could split working memory down into different component parts. So for our verbal storage task was a word span task. So we gave the participants a string of words, so a string of increasing span. If they so starting off with 3, so things like baby, nest, pillow. If they got that correct, then it would go on to 4 words, 5 words, and so on, until they made some mistakes. So that was our storage task. Our verbal processing task, we gave them a sentence and asked them to provide the last word. So Freddie got in a rocket and flew to the moon. So the last word was always very predictable. And then the verbal and processing and storage put both of these tasks together. So when my hands are cold, I put on my gloves. Quack, quack, said the duck, and then they would have to recall those words that they'd provided. Our visuospatial storage task was a simple span task. So we had a frog that hopped around on this 9 square grid, and the participants then had to indicate which squares the frog had jumped on. In the visuospatial processing task, the same grid was shown with 3 different shapes on it. Well, 2 of the same shapes and 1 different one, and they had to identify the shape that was the odd one out. And then in the visuospatial processing and storage task, so the complex span task, they had a series of these tasks. So they had to find the odd one out on each screen and then remember the location where the odd one out was located. So inhibition tasks, we had 2 different inhibition tasks. We had an animal stroop task that was, we used a task that Dinesh Suks had developed at Cambridge. So in this task, you're showing 2 animals. One's big in real life, so an elephant, and one's small in real life, a fish, but they are presented on the screen. So one's big on the screen and one's small on the screen. And so you have to identify the one that's bigger in real life and ignore the one that's bigger on the screen. And as part of the project, we also included a dot comparison task, which is often used in maths research to measure kind of how good you are at representing the amount of number, so your approximate number system. But as part of this task, to focus on the numerosity, you have to ignore the physical characteristics, so the size of the dots and the amount of the area that they take up on the screen, and it actually makes it's a really good inhibitory control task. So we used it in that way in this study. So we used it as an inhibitory control task. So you've got to say which of the 2 arrays has more dots and ignore which one takes up the most physical space. For our measure of shifting, we wanted to look at flexibility in terms of being able to see something in multiple different ways, rather than maybe switching between different tasks. So for that, we chose the animal sorting task from the NEPSI. And so you have to categorize, I think there's, I can't remember how many cards there are, maybe 8 or 12 cards, and you have to characterize them in as many different ways as you can. So it's things like a border and no border, yellow and blue, 1 animal or 2 animals, the sun shining or it's raining. So there's various different ways, and you ask in a time limit, children have to find as many different ways as they can to sort those cards. So on the maths tasks, each age group completed a different set of problems for the maths tasks. And this is because we wanted to make sure that the content was age appropriate for each group. So they were working, kind of at the right level for their age group. And so then in order to compare the relationships with executive function, what we did was we created Z scores within each age group for all of the variables. So, and we reverse coded these where necessary, so that for a larger score always equals better performance. And what this meant for the data was it was better in terms of being able to compare relationships between the executive functions and the math skills, but it means that we can't make any conclusions about absolute differences in maths performance between the different age groups. We're just interested in the different patterns of relationships between those variables. Okay, so what did we find? So looking at the first 2 research questions first, so which executive functions are related to factual, procedural and conceptual components of maths, and how do these relationships change with age? So we carried out a series of regressions to look at this. So the very first one we did was just checking that factual, procedural and conceptual skills are related to maths achievement, and they all are. They all explain unique variance in maths achievement. And then we carried out separate regressions for our different measures of maths, so the maths achievement test, and then factual, procedural and conceptual skills, to see the executive function predictors for each of these different components. And because we were interested in how these change with age, we used two contrasts to look at the developmental differences. So the first contrast that we did just compared the adults to the children. And then we also did another contrast which compared within the developmental groups, within the child groups. So we compared the year 4 children, so the 9-year-olds, to the year 7 and 9 children, the 12 and the 14-year-olds. In the second step, we entered in our executive function measures, so verbal working memory, visuospatial working memory, and then the animal Stroop, which in the slides was we called it a non-numerical inhibition task, dot comparison, which was the numerical inhibition task, and then the card sorting task of shifting. And then we looked at interaction terms, including interaction terms, to see how the relationships changed with age. So it's worth stating now that step 3 didn't account for any additional variance in any of the models. So there were no interactions with age. So the relationships between executive function and maths were the same, were stable from 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds right the way through to adulthood. So this doesn't mean that there weren't any age differences in their performance on the different tasks, just that the relationships with executive functions are the same across the different groups. Okay, so I'm going to show you a set of figures that look like these. So the 3 boxes that we've got here are for verbal working memory, visuospatial working memory, and numerical inhibition, which was the dot comparison task. So the animal Stroop task and the shifting task weren't unique predictors of any of the maths measures, so I've not included them on these diagrams here. So in terms of overall maths achievement as measured by the Wyatt, we found that there was a reasonable amount of variance explained by the executive function measures, and the unique predictors were verbal and visuospatial working memory for maths achievement. For factual knowledge, both verbal and visuospatial working memory and numerical inhibition explained around 12% of the variance in factual knowledge. Again, verbal and visuospatial working memory and numerical inhibition explained around 15% of the variance in procedural knowledge. But the role of executive functions in conceptual understanding was much smaller, so only around 5% of the variance, and this was largely driven by verbal working memory. So what do those findings mean? So executive functions seem to predict a moderate amount of variance in a curriculum level test of maths achievement, and a smaller amount of variance in those different cognitive components of arithmetic. And interestingly, we found that there were no interactions with age in terms of these relationships. So this, the relationship between executive functions and maths seems to be stable between the ages of 8 years and adulthood. So in terms of those 3 different components, so factual knowledge seemed to be uniquely predicted by both verbal and visuospatial working memory and inhibition. And so this is consistent with the idea that working memory is required to retrieve facts from long-term memory, and that interference between items need to be suppressed. So inhibition also plays a role. So this is a kind of against that argument that fact retrieval is just automatic. It does seem to rely on these kind of more advanced cognitive skills. And these findings are also supported by some experimental dual task work that we've done. So where we're taxing working memory while asking people to retrieve facts from memory. So there does seem to be certainly in the research that we've done, quite strong evidence that just retrieving facts involves working memory. Procedural skill, again, was uniquely predicted by both verbal and visuospatial working memory and inhibition. And again, this supports the role of working memory in representing the problem, storing interim solutions, and that inhibition may play a role in selecting the appropriate strategy. And conceptual understanding was predicted only by verbal working memory. So again, this is perhaps consistent with the role of working memory in retrieving concepts from long-term memory. But we didn't find the relationship with inhibition and shifting that we'd predicted. And one possible reason we think this might be is that lots of the maths tasks that we did, most of them were requiring you to, we were just measuring using maths and doing maths. We were testing what people had already learned rather than learning a new material. So it might be that inhibition and shifting, so being able to see different aspects of a problem and stopping yourself from launching in with a procedural solution, are really important when you're learning about concepts, but once you've understood them, they're less important, which might maybe why we didn't find the relationships. So the third research question that we had for this study was whether executive functions relate to maths achievement over and above the relationship with cognitive maths. So testing that hierarchical model of maths development developed by Geary. So we did a mediation analysis for looking at whether factual knowledge, procedural skill and conceptual understanding mediate the relationship between verbal and visuospatial working memory and maths achievement. We didn't do a mediation model for inhibition because it wasn't a unique predictor in the model of maths achievement alone, but I've included the arrows there just because I think it gives a good kind of overall picture of what we found in the study. But the mediation model with working memory showed that, yes, there is some mediation by factual knowledge, procedural skill and conceptual understanding, but that even once you add these factors into the model, there is still a direct relationship between working memory and maths achievement. So what does that mean? So cognitive level components of maths partially mediate the relationship between working memory and maths achievement. So a hierarchical model is a good way to conceptualize the relationship between executive function and maths, but there is also this direct path between working memory and maths achievement. So we were interested in thinking about what this might represent. And our kind of working hypothesis is that this direct path represents problem solving. So in these curriculum style maths tests that are often used, so often these are word problems. You're not just given the sum, you're given a context, and you've got to work out what's the maths, what have you actually got to do. You've got to identify the problem, construct the representation of that problem, and then develop a solution plan and then carry it out. And we think that working memory might be playing a role in doing those skills as well. That's something that we still need to go on and test. All right, so to draw some conclusions from that first study on arithmetic then. So executive functions are differentially related to factual, procedural and conceptual components of maths. So, it's more than just saying executive function is related to maths. You can break it down further than that. And factual and procedural skills in particular rely more heavily on executive functions than conceptual understanding. We actually broke it down even further than that in the paper to see how our different components of working memory tasks, the storage, the processing, and then the kind of executive load of combining them related to components of maths. But if you're interested in that, I suggest you go and see the paper. We also found that the relationship between executive function and maths are stable between 8 years and adults. And we think that there's two possible reasons for that. So one is that as I said, we're really looking at the skills involved when you're doing maths. So it's stuff that you've already learned and you're applying it. So it could be that when you're doing maths, no matter whether you're an adult or a child, when you're kind of solving sums, the skills that you need are exactly the same. You still need to represent interim solutions, suppress incorrect answers and all those kind of things. The second possible explanation is that individual differences in executive function are very important when you're learning maths early in childhood. So if you've got good executive function skills, you're able to learn some of the basics much more quickly, but that these differences kind of persist throughout the lifespan. So, once you're set on that trajectory, you carry on that path. And these two options aren't mutually exclusive, but we need to do some more research to kind of distinguish between them a bit more and test them a bit further. And finally, in terms of our final hypothesis, so testing that hierarchical model, so is it a direct or an indirect relationship between executive function and math achievement? Well, it's a bit of both. So executive functions play a direct role in maths achievement in terms of identifying and constructing the problem representation, but they also play an indirect role by first kind of supporting factual, procedural and conceptual knowledge, which then goes on to support overall maths achievement. Okay, so I quickly want to talk you through two more recent studies that we've done to kind of replicate and extend this. So the first one is looking at algebra and geometry. So this work was done as part of the PRISM project. So PRISM stands for Premature Infant Skills in Mathematics. So we've done two PRISM studies now. So this is a collaboration with Samantha Johnson, who's based at Leicester, who's the PI, Camilla Gilmore again, Victoria Sims at Ulster, Neil Marlowe in London, and Sarah Clayton, who's now with you in Oxford. And so as a bit of background to the project, we looked at maths and executive function skills in preterm, children born preterm, and in age-matched controls when they were first assessed them when they were 8 to 10 years of age. And we found that very preterm children have higher levels of mathematics difficulties than their peers. They tend to do particularly poorly in maths as a group. They have particular issues with procedural skills, but these seemed to stem from working memory and visuospatial problems. That's kind of a part of the characteristic features that can accompany preterm birth. We followed these children up when they were at secondary school, so 12 to 14 years of age, to see how their math skills develop, particularly as more complex math gets introduced. And we found that the differences in attainment between preterm children and their term-born peers remain stable over time. And these differences are still largely accounted for by poorer working memory and visuospatial skills. And so I think that the fact that preterm children's difficulties stem from at least partly from their working memory problems really backs up this relationship between executive functions and maths. So not only if you're have good executive functions, you do well in maths, but if you have poor working memory skills, seems to go alongside poor math skills. But I kind of don't want to focus too much on that today. What I want to talk about is, alongside all of this, we've got a whole load of beautiful control data on a lot of the same tasks and, well, a lot of the same constructs. We used some different tasks, but this gave us the opportunity to try and replicate the model that we'd found on the SUM data in a new sample with some new tasks, and also extend it beyond arithmetic to include the more advanced topics of algebra and geometry. So those were our main research questions. And so the sample for this study was 95 typically developing 12 to 14-year-olds. So that's kind of, I think most of them were kind of years 8 and 9. So the maths tasks that we used were the same as the maths tasks that we used with that age group in the SUM project. So that's easy to explain. So those were our arithmetic measures. We then also included measures of algebra and geometry. So these were taken from kind of existing tests in the literature. So the algebra was from the Concepts in Secondary Mathematics and Science Algebra test. So they had to solve some problems involving algebra, a kind of problem-solving based approach. And then geometry was taken from the Van Huyler Revised Geometry test. So it's a multiple choice where they had to kind of look at different shapes and make various decisions about those. Our executive function measures differed from the SUM project, however. So we did use separate measures of verbal and visuospatial working memory. So the verbal working memory task was a backwards word span. So it was modelled very closely on a backwards digit span task, but we didn't want to use numbers because it might have inflated any possible relationships with maths because of the use of numerical stimuli. So we used animal names instead. So for example, dog, cat, fish, and you'd have to say fish, cat, dog, and the span length would increase. Our visuospatial working memory task was the Mr. X task from the AUMA, the Automated Working Memory Assessment. So you'd be shown two little figures like this, and you'd have to say if the red circles were in the same hand of the little people or different hands, and then you'd have to remember one of those locations. And again, you'd have to do a few of these and then remember an increasing number of locations. Our inhibition measure was taken from the NEPSI task battery. So this was I won't say pen and paper task, but it's a paper-based task where you're shown a series of stimuli. So one of the versions was circles and squares and one was arrows. And you first have to name the stimuli. So circle, square, circle in the baseline condition, and then in the inhibition condition, you have to say the opposite. So you'd have to say square, square, or down, down. No, other way around, up, down. So you've got to say the opposite. And it gives a scaled score for that. But our shifting measure was the same. So we used the animal sorting task from the NEPSI. And we ran a similar mediation model that we'd run with the SUM data. So we've got verbal working memory, visuospatial working memory, inhibition, and shifting. The three components of arithmetic we looked at before, but we've added in algebra and geometry. So these here are the same lines that we found in the SUM project. The numbers here reflect the updated PRISM data. So again, we've got those indirect paths between working memory and inhibition through factual knowledge and procedural skill through to maths achievement. And we've got those direct paths from working memory to maths achievement as well. So we're getting very similar pattern of findings in the PRISM data. The only one that was not significant in this model was that relationship between verbal working memory to conceptual understanding. So the sample did much better on the conceptual understanding in this study than in the SUM task, so that might possibly explain that difference, but also it's quite a small effect before, so it might be that it's just quite a weak effect. But looking at algebra and geometry, so again, these seem to be part of that middle layer mediating the relationship between executive functional skills and maths achievement. So there were indirect paths from working memory to algebra and onto maths achievement, and the same for visuospatial working memory. So both verbal and visuospatial working memory predict algebra and geometry, leading on to maths achievements. So it was really nice for us to see that these findings replicated our SUM project. So executive functions play a direct role in maths achievement, so particularly working memory, which we think might be in terms of identifying and constructing the problem representation, as well as this indirect role through your factual knowledge, procedural skills, and conceptual understanding. Working memory in particular seems to play a role in algebra and geometry, which again might be due to the need to manipulate the structure of the problem, hold interim solutions in mind, and support these high-level processes in that way. Okay, so finally, for the very last part of the talk, I just want to briefly talk about some work that we've done looking at executive functional skills and maths at more an advanced level of maths. So this is going back to the SUM project again. So alongside the main grants, we were lucky enough that at the time we put the grant in, you could still get a linked studentship. So we had a PhD student on the project, Paula Hubber, and she was really interested in the role that executive function might play in more advanced maths. So in kind of skilled and expert mathematicians. And she was particularly interested in working memory as well. So I wanted to see what role it might play in kind of degree level mathematics skills. And there's some debate about this. So it could be that working memory actually, like we mentioned before, might be really important for learning maths when you're younger, but actually once you're very skilled at maths and you're performing maths, then actually it might play less of a role. So it might not be so important once you get to an advanced level. Another suggestion is that working memory might play a larger role in arithmetic, which again is often the area of maths that's studied when researchers look at maths and executive function in children, and it might play less of a role in more advanced maths. So particularly the kind of maths you're studying at university that might not even involve numbers. And there's very little research looking at this. So most of the research on executive function and maths is done in children, possibly with an adult control group, but the focus isn't really on the kind of the nature of the math that you're doing at this later level. And Paula was also really interested in the nature of what working memory might be important. So in particular, verbal versus visuospatial working memory. And there's been a lot of debate in the literature about kind of if one of these is more important for maths and how this might change with age. But the findings have been very mixed. So while everything that we've done actually seems to suggest that they're both important, there's been some research suggesting that the role of visuospatial working memory might decrease with age. But on the other hand, there's also been some research showing that it might increase with age. So Paula was really interested in testing these questions. And the way that we started off doing this was to look at number, word, and spatial complex span tasks in maths undergraduates compared to humanities undergraduates. So in this diagram here, so these show the tasks that we did. So here you can see the material we're asking people to retrieve. So this is our number complex span. So we're asking them to retrieve a sequence of numbers. Our word complex span again used animal names, and then our spatial complex span was that grid, and they've got to remember the location of the dots. We wanted to look at working memory, so look at storage in the face of ongoing processing, but we wanted a processing task. We wanted to use the same processing task across our different, because we're interested in storage, we want to look at the same processing task and keep it equivalent across all of our different types of storage information. So we chose a task that we hoped would be as neutral as possible with compared to the storage material, and we opted for a visual task where participants had to look at two photographs of different faces and say if it was the same person or not, and then do one of those in between each item of the storage task. So all participants completed spans from 2 items to 7 items, and they did that in a random order. So it wasn't the case where they just kept going until they couldn't do any more. We gave them the easy items and the more difficult items. And we also asked participants to complete the WASI matrix reasoning and vocabulary tests so that we could check kind of general ability across our different groups. And they also completed the Woodcock-Johnson calculation subtest. So our first experiment looked very promising. So here you've got those different types of storage. So you've got number, the spatial span task, and the word span task. And you've got math students in the solid line and the humanities students in the dotted line. And this is how many they got correct across all of those different spans. So as you can see, there was no difference on the number span, no difference on the word span, but the mathematics students were significantly better at recalling spatial information compared to the humanities students. And not only that, but the performance on the visuospatial working memory span correlated with their maths performance. So these findings look promising, but it looks like there might be some ceiling effects in the number task. So we wanted to replicate it just to be sure, and also try and explore what might account for these differences between groups. So we carried out another study just using the number and the spatial span task, because there didn't seem to be any difference between the number and the words. And we also included measures of short-term memory, so without the interleaved processing task, and a measure of spatial attention, so in this case a cued Posner task, to see if there might be more fundamental differences between the groups that could explain the difference in performance. So again, we found that the two groups didn't differ on the number task, but the math students were better than the humanities students on the spatial task. And again, there was a significant correlation between working memory, visuospatial working memory and math tasks. And these differences remained even when we controlled for short-term visuospatial short-term memory and endogenous spatial attention. So it does seem to be something to do with being able to hold visuospatial information in mind in the face of ongoing processing, rather than just being able to hold it in mind. There is one other possibility we hadn't ruled out, which was that it was just due to better visuospatial skills in general. So that explains the group differences, and that it's not actually anything to do with working memory. So that's what we went on. One of the things we went to look at in our third experiment. But one thing we also just wanted to double check was that we'd used the same processing task across our different storage conditions. And we wondered, do mathematics students always have superior visuospatial working memory capacity, or does it depend on the type of processing that's being carried out at the same time? And there's been some work done in the literature suggesting that yes, it does matter. So the storage is affected by the type of processing, but also that it might impact on relationships with other cognitive measures. So in this third study, we used two different processing tasks. So our verbal processing task was a word rhyming task. So you were shown two words and you had to decide if two written words on the screen, you have to decide if they rhymed or not. And the visuospatial processing task was a paper folding task. So you're shown a piece of paper and you're shown how it's folded with a dot, and you have to say if it was opened out, which of these options would it be? And to see if the results were just due to visuospatial working memory capacity, we used a mental rotation task. So, as quite so often happens, the results aren't quite so clear cut when you look into things in a bit more detail. So we found here we've got verbal storage and visuospatial storage in the face of verbal processing in the solid bars and visuospatial processing in the dotted bars. So verbal storage was more accurate when paired with visuospatial processing, and visuospatial storage was more accurate with verbal processing. So the opposite one, but there were no conclusive group differences. So when you change the type of processing, that group difference didn't remain. Mathematics students weren't any better than the humanities students. But luckily there was some good news. So although general visuospatial skills did explain some of the variance in maths performance, visuospatial working memory capacity was still an independent predictor of kind of maths performance. So finally, so this just confirms what I've shown you already. We compared across those two experiments. So yeah, the mathematics students are better with the neutral processing task, the faces processing task, but not with verbal or visuospatial. And why is that? So our explanation for this is based on suggestions by Mayaki and colleagues that processing tasks differ in their requirement for central executive involvement. So the face matching task that we used perhaps requires a relatively low central executive load, and the paper folding task a high central executive load. And so what we hypothesized that math students possibly do have a higher visuospatially kind of executive capacity. So for coordinating between different things, coordinating between the processing storage perhaps. So when the processing load is low, they can kind of take advantage of that to store more information, store more of the visuospatial information. But when the executive processing demands are higher, then that's no longer possible. Okay, so finally, to summarise across the whole talk, so if I want you to take anything away from today, my take-home message is that the relationship between executive function and maths is best represented as a hierarchical model in which working memory and inhibition play an indirect role in maths achievement by supporting factual knowledge, procedural skills, conceptual understanding, as well as algebra and geometry. But the working memory also plays a direct role in maths achievement, which might be in terms of, well, we think is in terms of identifying and constructing a problem representation, so also in problem solving. And that good visuospatial working memory capacity also seems to be helpful for studying more advanced maths. So yeah, I guess another take-home message is that executive function is important for maths at all ages and all levels of maths. So obviously the massive caveat in all of this is that the research is correlational, and so we don't really know the direction of causality. So we really need more longitudinal and kind of experimental research to really unpick these relationships in more detail. I'm very briefly going to mention classroom implications because I said I would, but I think the real take-home message is that there's lots of reasons why children might struggle with maths. And so you need to look beyond their overall level of achievement and look at the kind of profile of strengths and weaknesses in terms of their factual, procedural and conceptual skills, but also possibly different aspects of executive function as well, and consider the executive function demands of what you're asking children to do in maths in the classroom. And I really need to thank all of the wonderful people who I've worked with on this, so both on the SUM project and on the PRISM study. And thank you so much for listening. I know that everyone's time is especially precious at the minute, so I really appreciate it. And I'm more than happy to take any questions. Sorry for going on a bit long.
Thank you, Lucy. Right. So yeah, so we have a few minutes for questions. So if you could put your hand up if you have a question, then I'll try and manage this. And then you need to obviously unmute yourself while you're speaking. Okay. So, any questions? Okay, so we have a question here. Which one is it? Okay, I can't. Yeah, okay, so it's Kate. Okay, Kate, go on. Is you there?
Hi Lucy, thank you for your talk. I thought I'd just ask a question while other people are hopefully thinking of some questions. And it relates, I guess, partly to theoretical understanding and then the implications for the classroom from that advance in theory, which is about intervention and where to intervene or where to do the experiment, right? So, I mean, would your suggestion and recommendation be that, you know, given that you can, you know, the more distal level of the executive function, so does, you know, is the implication that we train and try and improve executive skills so that it will improve basic processes which will then lead to maths achievement, or do we not worry about executive function and then we actually intervene in algebra, factual knowledge, the other things that were at the sort of more proximal level in your model? So I think the interesting questions there, both for theory and understanding causal hypotheses, but also about implications for the classroom. So I'd like your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a brilliant question. I think that's kind of what's motivated a lot of research in this area. So you may well be aware, but lots of people have tried the approach of training the executive function skills, so the working memory training, and that doesn't seem to be effective. So for all that executive function is supposed to be a domain general skill, it's remarkable how specific some of the links actually seem to be. So yeah, in terms of training, you are better going more proximal, I think. And our best explanation of how to think about the executive function load at the minute is to do that, to think about the load. You know, these processes require executive function when you're doing them, but if you can reduce that load while you're learning those skills, then you're going to cement the maths bit, and then you can put the executive function in later. So a bit like with the adults at the end, they could store more in working memory when those processing demands were lower. So if you can lower the processing demands, you're going to increase the amount of working memory capacity, which then presumably will help it transfer better to working to long-term memory. So yeah, I think it's just being mindful of the role of executive functions.
Okay, Alan has a question.
Yes, one comment and one question.
Is it Alan or Anne?
Yeah, well, you both have your hand up, so so just yeah, maybe in turn. Thanks. Sorry, Anne, go ahead.
Sorry, we both started speaking at once. I guess apologies. I have one comment and one question. My comment is that there do indeed seem to be in many areas evidence for maths, including a lot of even just arithmetic, including a lot of different components which may dissociate from or be discrepant from one another, and that some intervention techniques do attempt to investigate to address target interventions to strengths and weaknesses in maths, and there's some evidence for this being quite effective, though there's rarely been clear-cut comparisons between targeted and one-size-fits-all interventions. The question is, do you have, I might have missed that, information about the IQ, verbal and spatial IQ or similar scores of the mathematicians and humanities students? Because one thing that sometimes comes up in research that I've been involved in related to such comparisons is that humanities students often have a very strong discrepancy between verbal and spatial abilities in favor of verbal abilities, while mathematicians tend to perform equally and quite well on verbal and spatial tasks. So I wonder whether some of the findings might be as much about how humanities students cope with a relative weakness in spatial ability as how mathematicians use their spatial abilities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I know in the first study they didn't differ at all on the verbal or the visuospatial reasoning. I think in the second study they did differ slightly on the visuospatial skills, but we haven't actually looked at the disparity. So that might be something interesting to do. I have to say, Paula's the main difference Paula noticed between maths and humanities students is that maths students turn up on time to do experiments and humanities students don't. So yeah, I can read too much into that.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting talk, by the way.
Thanks, Anne.
Okay, Alan. Alan had a question.
Hi. I'm an educational psychologist, Lucy, and this area is of great interest to educational psychologists. And I directly assess executive function as well as indirectly assess frequently in my casework. And we do a lot of training with teachers who often are not used to the concept of executive function, perhaps a little bit more familiar with memory and the impact of memory load in tasks. At the moment, something that's affecting our work a lot is the emotional side of executive function. So there's the cognitive aspects of executive function, which I think you've highlighted in your work with maths. But of course, there's an emotional aspect. And for example, maths anxiety is something that features, whereas we don't talk about geography anxiety. And I wonder to a certain extent the way in which you were perhaps thinking about emotional regulation, which I see as part of executive function, as part of your work. So it's my queries about that wider aspect of executive function, which is about self-regulation, which does, we look at both the cognitive and affective demands and the social demands in tasks for children in the classroom. And obviously at the moment, with COVID, it's very difficult, and we're much more aware of perhaps the trauma and the adverse experiences that children have had that impact on their ability to cope in the classroom. So it's that emotional load in maths, which I think is quite common, and obviously that link then with that emotional control, emotional self-regulation, and the way in which you might have explored that in your research.
Yeah, so we haven't done, I mean, you're right that I know it's another big factor, and I know there's some great work going on in maths anxiety as well. So we did include a measure of maths anxiety in the task battery, which we didn't include in this paper. So we've got some students who are looking at that at the minute to see how maths anxiety might fit into the picture, but it wasn't one of the main aims of the study. But yeah, I think ultimately there's so many different factors involved that we've got to start piecing together these little pieces of the puzzle, to try and, so that's one bit. But yeah, you're right, it's part of a bigger picture that we need to get a handle on all of these things really to get a proper understanding of how it all fits together. But yeah, no, I'll certainly take that on board and bear it in mind in the future as well.
Okay, so I think we're probably going to wrap it up here, but there's one more question. Do you want to take one more question? That's one from Elsie.
Yeah,
yeah, just if there's time left. Yeah, thank you, Lucy, for this great talk. This is Elsie joining from Amsterdam, so that's the joy of all these Zoom meetings. I have students working with me who are interested in the role of self-control and academic achievement, so both reading and math. And self-control in your picture, is that just the same as inhibition or ignoring distraction, or is self-control for you slightly different? How do I see self-control within executive functioning?
I guess there's lots of different ways that you could possibly think of self-control. So some of the different ways that we think about it are on different timescales. So a lot of the stuff that we've looked at is we're looking at it in a trials on a kind of trial by trial basis. So in the moment, when you're given a maths problem or this particular animal and number, can you get your cognitive resources involved to do it? But then executive control also plays a role over a longer time course. So when you're sitting in the classroom and you've got to ignore what's going on around you, to listen to the teacher and those kind of things. So, and for that, so we included a measure of the brief as a more kind of overarching, maybe longer time scale measure, which we've used a bit more looking at learning maths. And also, I know it's surreal, so I've got another PhD student who's looking more at metacognition. And I know it seems to be an area, so there's lots of overlap with executive function, and different people seem to agree and disagree as what's metacognition and what's executive function, and again that could come into self-control, as could what Alan was saying about emotion regulation. So yeah, I think possibly I'm not answering your question very well. I think it's slightly different, but exactly how I would define it, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear more about what you think, but maybe we haven't got time now to go into it.
No, I think that's great. So the time scale is important, and whether it's in a lab based or more like questionnaire based over a longer time. Yeah, that's a very good distinction.
Okay, I think we better wrap up. There's also some questions on the live stream, but perhaps Lucy, you could pop in and provide a response there later, because I know people need to get on with their day. But thank you so much, Lucy, for this really interesting talk and for joining us. There will be more seminars in this series that'll be advertised later on. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everybody. Just going to hang on for a moment just so I can say bye to you properly. Okay. How many left? Yeah. Just checking.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope it's okay that I call it off there. Just
yeah. I'm sorry for going over. I started. This might take too long, but yeah.
I sent you a message at some point. I didn't want to interrupt. I don't know if you could see it or not.
Oh, you can't see the chat at all.